and thank you for tuning in to the Phelan-McDermid Syndrome podcast, sharing research progress and hope. Today, we have two special guests. We have Dr. Natasha Ludwig, a pediatric neuropsychologist and program director of the Neurodevelopmental Neuropsychology Phenotyping Unit at Kennedy Krieger in Baltimore, Maryland. She also has an appointment as an assistant professor at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. Today, we also have Dr. Jenny Downs, who's the head of child disability team at the Kids Research Institute Australia in Perth, Australia. She also is an adjunct professor at the University of Western Australia. I'm so excited to have you both today to get some updates and the latest work associated with the Inchstone Project, which has been featured on this podcast before. So thanks again for being here. And before we get started and get some more information, can each of you let us know a little bit more about your background and how you found your way into the rare disease space? Let's start with you, Natasha.
Sure. So first of all, thank you so much for having us. We're really excited to be here today. I trained as a clinician in clinical neuropsychology and really started to specialize in seeing patients with rare neurogenetic conditions. I felt that, this was a space that definitely needs more attention. And I honestly got into the research space that I focus on specifically around clinical outcome measures, because as a clinician, I was pretty frustrated with the tools that we have to measure and monitor meaningful change in response to treatments in the patients that I see in clinic. And I felt that we needed to do better. And so this really motivated my work. And I've been a core researcher on the Inchstone Project since it began in 2021. And I know we'll talk more about that today. But I would say, my primary research focus is in the realm of neurodevelopmental phenotyping and the development of outcome measures for clinical care and clinical trial readiness for those with rare neurogenetic conditions, intellectual disability, and profound autism.
Yeah, thanks. We will dig into all of those topics a little bit later. And Jenny.
Thank you. Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Natasha. Thank you for having us. I started my career as a physiotherapist in Australia, or a physical therapist, as you call it in the US. And that includes about 15, 16 years of experience, and many of those children had rare conditions. Rare conditions are common. They're not rare as a group, they are common. And it was always really intriguing to me that we did not know enough about them, and it was really difficult to apply evidence-based practice. And so I started to work as a researcher. And since I started research, I stopped my clinical career and now I have a research career. And since then, I have about 17 years of research experience working with epidemiology to understand the patterns of symptoms, qualitative methods to understand parent experience, measurement science, and that's really why we're here today. And I've also run 3 clinical trials. So that is all about the composite of things that we need to do to have evidence-based practice, which we need so desperately with this group. And like Natasha, I'm an investigator with the Inchstone Project. I think we started in 2021, and I'm really proud to be a founding member of that group.
We are really honored to have both of you guys here. For those of our families who may or may not be familiar, can you share a little bit more about what the Inchstone Project is and what it aims to do?
Sure. So the Inchstone Project is led by Gabi Conacher and Jayetta Hecker, who are renowned patient advocacy group leaders here in the US and really internationally. And they work through the Decoding Developmental Epilepsies Foundation. So the Inchstone team comprises researchers and clinicians from multiple centers in the US and from Perth, Australia. So we know that individuals with profound neurodevelopmental impairments, like those with developmental and epileptic encephalopathies, or DEEs, have severe challenges, and yet they can do some critically important things, right? We know that the skill acquisition might be slow and occurs in small steps, but that these small steps, or inchstones, can be meaningful and need to be captured. However, most of our available outcome measures that we have don't capture what these individuals can do, their growth or their regression, all of which are really important to capture. So we at the Inchstone Project, we know that the success of clinical trials of truly disease-modifying treatments requires more sensitive outcome measures for this population. And so really the vision of Inchstone is to ensure that there are valid clinical outcome assessments for areas of functioning that are most important to families. And we hope that these measures can be helpful to clinical trials, but also to clinical care for these underserved patients.
Yeah, I mean, as my background in clinical psychology, you are clearly speaking my language here and really emphasizing something that I think hopefully our community can resonate with our families, that especially from the clinical care side, our families are seeing their loved ones grow and develop and learn new skills and sometimes lose some skills they've developed. But it's hard to capture with these measures that typically have been developed on a normal population. And so I just love just sort of the inherent reason behind what you guys are doing. But I think even more importantly now that, we have the Jaguar gene therapy trial that just started and there's some other trials kind of in the pipeline, that it's going to be really important to mark change that is happening. And, we know from other rare disease populations that sometimes without the right outcome measure, some of these trials can fail. And so what you guys are doing is really necessary. I know you guys were able to recruit a fair number of individuals with Phelan-McDermid Syndrome. Are there any takeaways you learned about our community from this work?
Absolutely, there are learnings for this group, the Phelan-McDermid Syndrome group. So the survey that we did recently was called the DEE Parent Speak Survey. We collected information between June and November in 2023, and in those 4 to 5 months, we collected an amazing data set from 267, correct that, 267 families, and it really was amazing because it really demonstrated the energy and the motivation of the community, and it speaks very loudly that this work is much needed. It was a very short period, but a very substantial and robust response. And of that group, 45 families had a child who is part of the Phelan-McDermid Syndrome community, and that was nearly 20% of our sample. It was the largest gene group represented. So there was really extraordinary contribution from your community. If we look at that group in our sample, there were some similarities and there were some differences. They were similar in that there was a fairly even split of boys and girls. There was the Phelan-McDermid Syndrome children were slightly older than the rest of our group, but average age 3 years older. There were fewer children with Phelan-McDermid Syndrome who had seizures and more children with Phelan-McDermid Syndrome who had autism. And so we see that there's probably less clinical severity, fewer children used a G-tube for feeding, and more could communicate back and forth with other people, including people they knew well and people they didn't know well. But Phelan-McDermid Syndrome was just as complex as all of the other conditions, with a blend of medical and functional difficulties. Parents still described communication as challenging, and they wanted their child to be able to express much more clearly their needs, their wants, their wishes, whether they had pain and so forth. They really wanted more extensive communication skills in their children. So there were similarities very strongly across the group.
Thanks so much for that summary. And also huge shout out to our PMS community for having such a, great showing up for this. So go team. It's really, I think, important that, we have these platforms where families can participate and really contribute to this research. And so just so our families know, because I don't think they're probably used to hearing that their kids are communicating a little bit more back and forth compared to other kids. And so can you give a sense of some of the other disorders that were part of this study?
We had We had 267 families with one. They reported on one child, so that's 267 children. And I say children because they were mostly children, but we had adults as well. The other conditions might have included SCN2A, SCN8A, FOXG1. We had ASXL 1 and 3. Gene groups that were well represented. Each of those groups has a range of presentations. So it's not easy to say one group has more difficulties or less difficulties than another. And the things that I picked out are just a few of the indicators that we have for the children, but we did have more parents with a child with Phelan-McDermid syndrome who ticked that box. Now, that is a broad categorical indicator. And so that might mean that they can communicate back and forth with their child in the family, but also there is some evidence of seeing some back and forth communication with somebody else who is not known. And this is not a big difference, but it was a little bit different between the different groups. And I think it tells us what a range of phenotype we actually have for not only Phelan-McDermid syndrome, but for the DEE groups as a whole.
Absolutely. And, I think we will dive into it a little bit more that, communication is so much more than just verbal communication. And so that's also really important to note that sort of having any sort of, augmentative device or nonverbal gestures and things like that sort of encompass that whole thing. Those are all very important skills, and something that the Inchstone Project really, is able to sort of capture some of those nuances. So I do want to shift gears a little bit and talk about your new paper, Natasha, which is on quality of life. It seem obvious, but quality of life is kind of an overlooked or underappreciated aspect in this research. So can you first share with families why you chose to examine quality of life?
Sure. So this was a wonderful collaboration with the Inchstone Project, and Jenny was a senior author on this paper, and so we're really excited about it. But certainly the impacts of Phelan-McDermid syndrome are complex and extensive, affecting the child and family members. And we understand, there are immediate effects of medical issues and impact on functional abilities. However, we also need to explore the impacts, to quality of life, which is less immediate and more of a big picture perspective. But is typically one of the most important outcomes for families, and I can speak that from, talking with families in research studies, but also providing clinical care to patients as well. This is a big deal for families and a big focus, that their child lives well, and so that's why we wanted to investigate quality of life. We really need to accelerate the research that understands the factors that have important impacts on quality of life, and then this can really open the door to finding ways to improve quality of life. So avenues for intervention.
Absolutely. So tell us a little bit about what the findings are and kind of what you did in the study.
Sure. So, this is a slightly smaller subset of 242 individuals who participated in that original Inchstone Parent Speak Survey. And that's just because the quality of life measure was towards the end of the survey, so some people fell off. But fun fact, the study actually includes 45 families with Phelan-McDermid syndrome. So, all those families with Phelan-McDermid syndrome who started the Inchstone Project survey kept going and completed it all the way through to the quality of life measure. So, they're all included in this smaller study. So thank you to all the families. So let's get into the details. We measured quality of life with the Quality of Life Inventory Disability, or the QI disability for short. And this is a 32-item questionnaire that asks about physical health, emotions and feelings, social interactions, leisure activities, and independence. And it's a really neat measure developed by Jenny and her colleagues, specifically for individuals with neurodevelopmental disabilities. And this was our main measure of interest for this study. And we really wanted to know what are the factors that contributed to higher and lower quality of life. And so on this Parent Speak survey, we also measured some other medical variables like seizures and cortical vision impairment, as well as a range of functional abilities like use of a touch screen, being able to participate in dressing and undressing, as well as the developmental profile 4, which is a developmental measure. It's a parent report questionnaire, and it includes different domains like cognition, motor functioning, communication, independence in activities of daily living, etc., as well as social emotional skills. And so our results showed that there are several key factors with the potential to influence quality of life in individuals in our sample. And again, our sample was primarily individuals with DEEs and other severe neurodevelopmental encephalopathies, including Phelan-McDermid syndrome. And so some of the main findings were that cognitive skills played a central role in differentiating groups with higher and lower quality of life on the total score, so on the overall score on the quality of life measure, as well as the positive emotions domain score. Additionally, communication skills were important in terms of social interaction. So there's a specific social interaction domain on this measure, and communication was very important. Also, physical skills contributed to the negative emotions domain. And then also, a number of anti-seizure medications contributed to the physical health score. And then the developmental profile for adaptive behavior scores mapped onto leisure aspects of quality of life. And then I did want to mention, interestingly, the use of a touch screen was very important as well for that kind of overall quality of life, which was interesting to see. And also, undressing and dressing contributed to the independence domain as well. So yeah, we learned a whole lot from this, and we're still really, making sense of it all. But it was very, very interesting. And I would say, kind of taken together, these distinguishing factors do point to potential intervention pathways, such as promoting cognition, social engagement, and participation in daily living activities that could be targeted to enhance quality of life for those with severe functional impairments.
Thank you for summarizing that. There is a lot of rich data there, and we'll make sure to include the article in our show notes so parents can access and look at. Thinking through, again, my clinical psychology lens, some of these findings are not super surprising. You have kind of that relationship between cognitive skills and the overall score. You have a relationship between communication skills and social interactions. But then you have also this finding around negative emotions and physical motor skills.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. And so I'm a little bit interested what you guys think about that.
The physical scores measured using the DP4 accounted for important differences in that negative emotions domain on the quality of life measure. And it was interesting. Children with higher physical capabilities had more difficulties in regulating their behaviors. And so I think it suggests a complex relationship between physical functioning and emotional well being, of course. I think greater motor abilities, which are typically indicative of less severe overall impairment, may enable individuals to express, a broader range of challenging behaviors, such as frustration, anger, or other negative emotions. And then, contrast, individuals with more profound physical limitations may have fewer means to communicate their emotional discomfort. Potentially leading to an underestimation, of negative emotional experiences. So, I do think it highlights the importance of really considering expressive capacity when interpreting emotional well-being in this population, and thinking about how can we understand mental health in individuals with less capacity to express their emotions or communicate.
Absolutely. And I think that clearly comes out of there as you're thinking about some of these clinical recommendations is that if you do have a child that has fewer motor challenges, that kind of tagging on that positive emotion regulation is going to be really important too. So making sure we're building coping skills and things that are kind of developmentally appropriate based on their cognitive and language skills. Anything else that's particularly exciting about this paper and their findings?
I think the paper is incredibly exciting because our vision is the best quality of life for the children, and that is, as Natasha said earlier, what is most important to families. So the whole of the paper is very exciting to us as a group, but there were two things that we were particularly interested in. One is that we use the developmental profile for our measurement of functional abilities: cognition, physical, adaptive behaviour, communication, and social emotional domains. And that was very sensitive to changes in quality of life. And that was really gratifying to us because we are interested in sensitivity where skills and behaviours are particularly difficult for the children. So we found sensitivity with this tool. So we were really excited about that. And the second thing that really excited us, that here we have a group of children who, by entry into the survey, had severe developmental challenges and functional challenges. But there were so many individual differences that packaged up in different ways for each of them and then affected their quality of life. They are not one group of children with severe impairments. They are a very varied group in the factors that make a difference to how well they lived. So we were excited to see a very clear demonstration of the individuality of the children in this data set.
Yeah, I love to hear that and see that, both as a researcher, but also as a clinician, because again, I think so many of these measures just sort of clump individuals in kind of one area, and you missed those nuances and that individuality that all of our families see in their loved ones. So I wanted to follow up on 2 points of sort of both around your two exciting things. Is one, I love to hear that there was such sensitivity from the DP4. I think as a psychologist, someone who's using measurements and tools, that sounds really important. And it seems like something that maybe our industry pharma partners should also be hearing from the rooftops of maybe this is something we should consider more. And I'd love to hear quickly kind of your thoughts around, like, is this something that could be embedded in more of these clinical trials where it isn't yet? Or do you still have some concerns kind of about its use in that way?
I think most measures have strengths and they have weaknesses. Here we have a measure that can be easily administered to parents, so that is a strength. We have this sensitivity to the outcome that matters, quality of life, so that is a strength. We do have some weaknesses that we identify in it. There are some difficulties with some of the questions. But the balance is strengths and difficulties. It overall is coming out as a more valuable instrument than we had thought at the beginning. And we do believe that these data should be taken on board by industry, pharma, those who are running clinical trials, and maybe in the first instance consider it as an exploratory measure, just to sort of start getting it into that narrative and understanding what that means in relation to other measures. So you have hit the nail on the head. We do want these measures used when we have evidence to do so.
Great. That's great to hear. And, I'm just excited because that has obviously been a really big challenge in Phelan-McDermid syndrome and many of these other DEEs as well. So the other thing I wanted to talk about, as you were talking about individuality, that came up in my mind was kind of an idea that some other groups also have pursued in terms of subtyping. It's sort of, I know, a little like niche, and some groups are doing it with AI and things like that. But I am curious if, kind of, as you're looking at all of these different neurodevelopmental disorders and rare disorders, whether there are patterns that are not necessarily based on their genetic diagnosis, but perhaps patterns that are more associated with kind of their profile from the DP4, for example.
I don't think we can completely answer that, but what we do know is that every gene group has a range of presentations within that. Much of the range of the presentation relates to either whether seizures have developed or not, but also the domains of functioning and adaptive behaviour that are measured with the DP4. So you have absolutely hit upon one of our next tasks, which is to collect DP4 data a second time with other questions and evaluate how that changes over time to understand if we have groups who stay the same and are stable, or groups who are changed, either they gain skills or they lose skills. And that will be really interesting for us to see if it can be used to group children into a richer understanding of how they are living and functioning.
There's just so much data and so much other analysis you can do with this in collecting more data. So I am very excited to hear and probably have you back on a couple times. You brought up the touchscreen finding. And I really want to probe it more because there is this part of me that's a little worried that, pop culture media is going to get a hold of this article, twist the findings to get a bunch of clicks, and it's going to be like, hey, it's okay to give your kids a tablet all the time. It's going to improve your quality of life. And so you kind of got there, but explain this to our families a little bit more, what your finding means and what you would actually recommend.
I think you're right in that we have excess screen use across our communities. That's here in Australia. I'm sure it's the same for you in the US. So parents are mindful that they don't want too much screen use. But here we have a different group. We have a group who still need those skills and opportunities to be actually able to use the devices. And if they can use the devices, it is often for activities, and that is play. That is learning. We all play and learn with our devices. They can share experiences with others and even helping. There are some ways that having a device can help to calm those children's emotions. So this is just like other kids. So we're not saying widespread, nothing else matters but screen use, but we're saying that should be in the mix. If you have the skills and can use them, it can help your quality of life, those children's quality of life. And then the issue of managing screen time use for lifetime balance is a later question, but having the skills in the first place, we believe has merit for the children.
I think something that you touched on there is that maybe some of our families are or are not thinking about are the basic skills that you do need to be able to navigate a tablet are really important, and not all kids with DEEs necessarily have those. And so kind of going back to some of your early points around awareness and motor skills, like all of those things are really key. And so it's nice sort of that you see that then connection with this specific finding.
And in line with what you were kind of saying there, I think we need to explore it further, but my thought is also that the touchscreen is important because it could provide a new modality of communication as well, right? And so touching a screen to make a choice or indicate a preference opens up that opportunity for more agency and independence, which is key for quality of life.
Yeah.
And one other thing I wanted to mention too, with all the findings from this quality of life study, it's important too to keep in mind that the findings must be taken within the context of the sample that was studied, right? So specifically, we included children with very severe impairments and many with a developmental epilepsy. And so we'll just have to be careful when extending the findings to other populations.
Excellent point. So we talked a little bit about it, but what are the next steps for Inchstone, this data set?
We're preparing a second survey to follow up on this first survey. And the purpose is to collect longitudinal data. After 2.5, 3 years, we will have a second set of information on hopefully many of the families who joined the first survey, but also new families as well. So we see that as very important to understand. You mentioned it before, Lauren, the patterns of phenotype over time. That is important for us to understand how change can be interpreted and how children could be grouped for clinical trials. So that is a part of that objective. And also we will have more data on the measures that we're validating, so that gives more strength and depth to our validation studies. We want to include more focus on communication and behaviours. They're both critically important domains. And we also are preparing 2 additional modules, one on economic impact of DEEs, and the second module on parent and family impact. These are relatively short. They are not our core goal of Inchstone, but they are critically important domains, and we will be able to use those to go with all of our advocacy, because a big part of Inchstone, led by Gabby and Jayada, is the advocacy that we do across the community to pharma and to regulatory bodies. So the new survey is like the old one, but with expanded components, because we are so much clearer of our goals and the needs of the community.
Right. Yeah, a lot of that seems like natural, logical next steps. And so we'll keep our community updated for sure. And hopefully we get some good participation from our PMS community again. There's always going to be more to be done. And, in terms of this, I'm going to segue again to another topic. There's just so much I want to talk to you guys about. But I know, Jenny, you have a ton of expertise in the area of clinical meaningfulness. And I know we talked about it a little bit, or has kind of come up as a term. So what is clinical meaningfulness?
Thank you. Traditionally, the classic definition of meaningful change is an amount of improvement in a health outcome that is thought to be meaningful. And it's as is perceived by a specific person or a specific population. And so we have talked to families. This is about what meaningful change means to them. And not surprisingly, there are as many different interpretations of what meaningful change is as there are families. For some, small changes would be meaningful. Others want big changes. Some want health and functioning to be stable and steady and not have so many ups and downs that they are constantly having to adapt to new circumstances every day that may be difficult to manage. And others want ongoing developmental change, a small change, but they want more and more and more. So meaningful change to the DEE community is a very complex topic, but it is important that we ask that question. We know what parents have told us. For example, stability. How is stability as a meaningful change considered in clinical trials? Clinical trials want improvement, but if we have a stability outcome, we haven't done that before. So this is families giving us information that is stretching the boundaries of what we understand and can only help us to design trials better for their needs. So it's really exciting to even ask that question. And also it tells us that we need to be able to capture meaningful change in the measures that we use. And if we have meaningful change, why is that important? We need to capture that bigger why, which is families functioning better and children living with a better quality of life. So it gives us very important information.
Right. I mean, it ties in so nicely with the quality of life. I also really appreciate you bringing up stability as potentially a meaningful change, because especially I'm thinking around our families whose loved ones are affected by neuropsychiatric illness, where we know that there's sort of these episodic times of either catatonia or manic behavior. And so the idea of stability to some of these families would be meaningful and really change quality of life. But that is often, like you said, not something that is necessarily targeted in clinical trials. And so, yeah, I'm glad we're talking about it. And now we need some measures to measure it.
That's right. That's right.
So go on.
Go on.
Yeah, I was going to ask, on the research academic side of things, obviously this like clinical meaningfulness has been a buzzword, and maybe not so much for our lay community. And so I think it's really important to emphasize to our families and community tuning in is that some of this excitement and buzz around clinical meaningfulness is really tied to those clinical trials and what we think of as a successful trial. And so, Can you give us a little bit of an overview of what your research has done so far in this space beyond kind of the overview and definition you already gave?
Yeah, thank you, Lauren. So this goes back to the our description earlier of the survey with 267 families, and one of the questions, or some of the questions they asked were, what was a priority domain for your child? And if they picked communication or gross motor, whatever they picked, they were asked what would be a change that would be small but meaningful. It would make an important difference to you, and then we said why. So that's our sort of way of thinking about meaningful change. Meaningful change matters because we want to know what difference on the domain is important, but why explains it and actually gives a rationale for the new medicine, the new treatment, or whatever to anyone who's interested in that, in either agreeing to fund or approve that medication. So that meant we had text. Parents wrote those changes down into open fields. And we were able to analyze that data with a content analysis. And we focused on the functional abilities of communication, gross motor, fine motor, and eating, both safely and independently. And with those 4 functional domains, we found 86 codes, if you like. That is a chunk of information that captures a group of quotes that parents gave us. And the common codes described capacity to communicate preferences, emotions, gaining sitting and walking skills were important for this group, being able to hold objects for play and use them, eating food without choking, and using eating utensils. And one of the things that was particular about our analysis was that we mapped these codes from the text that parents wrote to the categories of functioning that they had answered in different questions where they would tick which category their child belonged to for each of those functional domains. And so we found that across the board, from the children who found communication very difficult to children who were more advanced in their communication skills, parents still described communicating needs, wants, likes, expressing pain as critical across the board. For receptive communication across the board, parents described a better understanding and being able to follow an instruction. And also across the board, even children who could eat quite easily, or seemingly quite easily from our questionnaire, still experienced choking periodically, and parents still wanted to reduce the choking for their child and playing meaningfully with objects. And so then when we looked at the domain of gross motor function, that was quite particular because the meaningful change codes mapped to where that child was in their gross motor skills. So the children who were more impaired, their parents wanted them to hold their heads up or sit. And for children who were able to walk, there were different changes that parents saw important there. And then we come to the why all of these meaningful changes were important. They were more universal across the whole sample. Parents wanted meaningful change to impact their child's health and independence and safety. They wanted less impact to reduce the care regimens, freeing up some time and energy to themselves. And they universally spoke about better quality of life for the children and for the parents and the families. So it gives us really important information. It was an extraordinarily rich section of our survey.
I think it maps again really nicely onto the original quality of life paper we were talking. But, I think one of the things specifically you mentioned that we haven't talked about yet or is around that feeding and choking. And that is something that our community, the Phelan-McDermid Syndrome community, definitely has some challenges around. And so thinking about that as meaningful change, definitely, I would imagine, resonates for a lot of our listeners. And I think the other thing that I really like kind of that came out of this study is, like you said, sort of no matter where they are at their developmental stage is that you're going to find meaningful change kind of wherever you are. And so it just sort of looks kind of, to use Inchstone, it's like, where is that Inchstone, that, that next step up that could provide additional safety or quality of life? And I do want to go back to Natasha because you are an early investigator. And I'd love to know a little bit more how this idea around clinical meaningfulness has influenced you and you as a researcher, because kind of when I was at your stage, it wasn't really a term or a buzzword that was around. And I really do think it would have influenced how my early work started and where it went.
Sure. So I'm so lucky to be working with Jenny and the others who are all very interested in understanding clinical meaningfulness and really pushing the needle forward around, how we understand clinical meaningfulness. And so I think, to measure clinical meaningfulness, we need meaningful measures, right? And the way that we do this is through co-design methods. So what I mean by that is working with patients and families to ensure that their voices are integrated into that measure development process itself from the very beginning. And so, we mentioned earlier a bit about how those foundational aspects of cognition are really important to measure and intervene upon and monitor as we have, data that's relevant to quality of life. But we don't really have great measures yet. The DP4 did give us some information, but I think there's more to be done. I'm really excited. I'm leading a new 5-year research study in partnership with the Inchstone Project that's focused on developing novel direct and parent report measures of this concept of, awareness, alertness, responsivity to the environment, those foundational aspects of cognition. And really, the project starts with understanding, well, what do we mean by this, right? Like, what do we mean by awareness, alertness, responsivity? And the way that you do that is talking with patients and families and clinicians, right, who serve these patients. This is critical in making sure that the measures we're developing include all of the aspects of alertness, awareness, and responsivity that are most meaningful to patients, right? The project starts with understanding what we mean by the concept of awareness, alertness, and responsivity. And so this will be done through qualitative work, which is really critical in making sure that the measures include all of the aspects of responsivity that are most meaningful to patients. And so then we'll use this conceptual model to develop the measures. And so we're currently in year 1 and drafting the model as we speak, which is really exciting. And we started to draft this conceptual model with some of the open-ended responses to questions about these concepts in our bigger Inchstone Parent Speak Survey. And soon we'll be recruiting families for individual interviews to further refine the draft model further. So it's exciting. We've already learned so much from the families, and so I'm so grateful for everyone's participation and all those who participate in the future as well.
What an incredible and important project. And this is actually how, just so our community knows, how I kind of met and had my introduction to you. We were both at the Gatlinburg conference in spring, and you had a chance to talk about this project more. And I immediately thought, I need to talk to Natasha and bring her on the podcast. And familiar already with Inchstone, but I'm really excited to see where this goes. And, as we talked about, the individuals with Phelan-McDermid syndrome are so heterogeneous. And so I really do think that this is going to be really helpful for some of our families. And I hope that they can participate. Thank you for being here. And, as we wrap up, I'd love kind of for each of you to share any parting messages you have in general about the research we talked today, or specifically to our Phelan-McDermid syndrome family.
I'll start. I have several messages for the Phelan-McDermid syndrome community, and first to say that it's been a real privilege to work with you on our research and learn from you about your child and your family. It is gold what you have contributed to our survey, and we thank you from our hearts, the bottom of our hearts. Your stories give us your expertise, and that is extraordinary in managing difficulties and are so full of energy and hope. So we find that very inspirational. And it's also important that, like Natasha has said, there's co-design and interviews. It's really important that, as well as our survey, we hear from you about what you need us to do with our research so that we can respond appropriately to what you need. And finally, our work's not finished. We'll be back, and we very much look forward to developing longer relationships with you through our work.
Yeah, and I just want to echo what Jenny said. I just want to share that the best work is done together, right? So let's continue these conversations and share stories, reflections, ideas. And this is really how we will move the field forward towards better treatments for Phelan-McDermid and other rare neurogenetic conditions. So thank you so much, Lauren, for having us, and to all you for listening.
We're so grateful for the dedication and time that you've put into this work and into our community specifically. You said it best of that kind of, this all works together when we're working together. And I love that co-design has been not only a key part of your own research or the research we talked about today, but we're seeing it increasingly in the Phelan-McDermid Syndrome community. And so, again, huge kudos to our families and caregivers who are actively participating in making that happen. So, thanks for being here. And I really hope we'll get to see you guys at our 2026 Family Conference, which is being held July 15th to 19th at the Gaylord Rockies Resort in Aurora, Colorado.